Did House Democrats reject an olive branch from the governor? We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Good evening, and thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois government and politics. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn, with Illinois Issues and Illinois Public Radio. And with me today is Professor Kent Redfield, retired professor of political science with the University of Illinois. Professor, glad you're here.
Good to be here.
And Andy Maloney, State House Bureau Chief for the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Andy, glad you're here.
Good to be back.
So, as we've kind of carried on this show through the never-ending summer and fall session, we haven't always had a lot to talk about, but we saw a lot of action this week when the legislature was back in town. But first, I want to start off with some of the things the governor has done this week. Professor, the governor has kind of shifted his position on a few different key issues. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the announcements his office made?
Well, he announced an agreement on child care. He had lowered the standard, making it more difficult for people to qualify for child care, and he'd lowered that down quite dramatically, made us the most difficult state in the country to get on qualify for child care. He rose that up fairly close to where it originally was through an agreement. He withdrew a request to the federal government, to the Medicaid people, to increase the standard in which you qualify for home health care or nursing home care. There was an agreement that was announced on unemployment insurance. There were two things that he did. Two things with the incentives the state offers to businesses with the EDGE credits and with the filmmakers, and he announced a willingness to appropriate some of the money that is not general revenue funds, most specifically motor fuel taxes, the money to pay lottery winners, and even wanted to go a little further than what the Democrats had in their original bill. And so the governor was presenting this as, I'm being reasonable, I'm compromising, here are some ways that we can go forward to fund these programs, that we're either spending money that we couldn't have spent on anything else, or we're committing ourselves to spending more money that we don't have. But it does, it looks like a little bit of movement, and certainly given how bleak things have been since the 1st of July, that's certainly, I think you have to be a little bit encouraged at least.
So on both of these social services programs, the child care assistance program and the care for folks who are needing care in their homes, the governor used his executive power to try to limit eligibility to save some money. Democrats not happy about that. Andy, how did they react to him now saying that, okay, I'm not going to limit things as much as I had tried to?
Right. Well, so as much as perhaps the governor's people or Republicans wanted this to look like breaking the logjam a little, or being good faith compromise, I think the cynical approach, which some Democrats took in a lot of opinions, is this isn't movement. You're the one that took away this stuff to begin with, so this isn't really compromise. This is sort of a return to the status quo. And what we saw this week, it wasn't just the governor announcing these things, but also the House Democrats really kind of ramping up and trying to move these bills, despite the fact that the governor had an agreement in place to acquiesce on some of the child care funding, to go ahead and try and take his executive power to ever make changes in that area again, and also move them back to, I think, the 185% federal poverty level that they had been at before the beginning of the fiscal year. And it was interesting that you opened that segment that way with, the difference is we had stuff happening this week. The same thing is it's all caught up in a lot of political theater.
Well, in both of those bills that would have overturned these actions from the governor, failed in the House. Professor Redfield, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on with those votes and why those votes took place in the first place, if there was some kind of compromise?
Well, clearly what the governor gives, the governor can take away. And so there was certainly the social service providers wanted to lock in rather than allow the governor to have discretion, they wanted to lock things in at the levels that they're at. It also was pretty clear that the reason the governor was moving is that he was going to lose Republican House members. Those two bills and the bill allocating the motor fuel tax, the lottery, the 911, those would have passed absent the governor taking some kind of action. And there's a clear, there's no question that he would have had the votes in the Senate to do that. And so part of it was the governor was acknowledging the reality that was there. The Democrats,
you can't fire me because I quit.
Yeah.
Preempting them before they would have.
But the Democrats also wanted to get the Republicans in the House on a roll call again, voting against children, voting against seniors and the disabled. And the governor is not going to be on the ballot next year. It's the members of the legislature that are going to be on the ballot. The child care bill and the bill having to do with determination of need for seniors and disabled. Those did not pass because one representative Ken Duncan, who's a African American from Chicago, voted or actually refused to vote on both of those, and so they fell one vote short. The Democrats need every one of their 71 members to override a veto. They were one vote short again. They have lost. Every time the governor has tried to have a veto sustained, he's been able to do that, and it's very, Democrats really don't have any margin for error, and so there's a whole bunch of politics tied up in what Representative Duncan was or wasn't doing in terms of, cutting deals with the governor. I mean, it's clear that there was an agreement between the Democratic representative and the Republican governor that led to him not voting on those bills. And what the repercussions of that going out are, really nobody knows at this point. It's clear that the House members of the House, the Democratic members of the House, and the Speaker are very frustrated. And some of that frustration seems to be aimed at the Democrats in the Senate and Senate President Collerton. And it just highlights how difficult this is to get. Even when you've got agreements, you really have to have the Speaker and the Senate President and the Governor on the same page, and the wheels can come off pretty easily. And now the bill having to do with allocating the motor fuel tax is kind of hung up a little bit, although it's not clear that it's really going to get slowed down in the long run. But so you still got a lot of posturing and a lot of politics, and it's not whether this gets us closer to a budget deal. I'm not sure, because we haven't resolved collective bargaining, we haven't resolved unemployment or workers' comp, we haven't resolved property tax freeze, tort reform. There are tough issues out there before we get to an impossible situation of actually trying to balance the budget halfway through the year.
Well, and we've talked on the show a lot recently about Representative Duncan kind of going rogue from the Democratic caucus. He's been making the rounds since missing these votes, kind of trying to explain himself. Andy, what is he saying as far as why he did this? Yeah,
I mean, he's saying that it's a win. He wanted and believes that he showed that the governor is somebody that they can work with, that might be stoic at times and want to still achieve his aims in office, but that he can be moved on some of this stuff. He's saying, look, getting up to, I think the level is 162% on child care is a good thing. Instead of, perhaps if they had passed the bill, even if they had passed the bill that they tried to pass and he didn't vote for, the governor could have sort of slow-walked that veto. That's another 60 days before anybody gets anything. And in those 60 days, a lot of people would have been forced to, adjust, lost jobs, tried to make ends meet to get child care for their kids. So it would have been a difficult situation. And he's saying, with this move, we can actually take some action now. He's saying it was not, anything like a quid pro quo, although Professor Redfield did mention that there was a project that he certainly has advocated for before with the film tax credits. He represents a part of Chicago that is pretty distinct, parts of Michigan Avenue and other kind of famous areas that filmmakers like to go to. But that's basically the line that he's saying. Whereas, I think Speaker Madigan, for instance, had a couple of things during his availability this week that were pretty enlightening, and not just sort of the functioning in the extreme and the things that he'd been saying over the summer. But he said, the idea that I tell everybody and can get everybody in lockstep on every single thing is laughable. It would be interesting to go back and look and see how many times he was able to get exactly 71 people on something over the years, because wasn't able to do it to the extent that he could do it for this stuff. He also said that it's good that some of this stuff is moving, that some action is being taken just very generally, but they're still a long ways off from an overall kind of budget agreement.
Well, and I want to go back to talk a little bit about this unemployment insurance legislation. Maybe not the most exciting topic, but it's something that was on the governor's agenda. It's one of the only things we've seen that, really the only thing we've seen from his agenda that seems to have some broad support. Andy, what would this legislation do?
So basically it makes some changes with the who gets insurance, of folks who are unemployed. This was negotiated with unions and business interests, some groups that have been all over the news over the years since Rauner took office, and obviously have been on different sides of several issues. But in essence, it basically says, people who are laid off from a job because they destroyed an employer's property or provided false information on their applications, those people don't get those benefits. So that's sort of the compromise that the governor announced, in addition to all of this other stuff. And it's right in front of a scheduled leaders meeting next week that maybe not. We don't know what we're going to see out of that yet, because it may or may not be televised. It may or may not have agenda. We don't know where it's at, but that could be another reason why some of the stuff is moving when it did.
And it's important to note there's a provision in this bill that says that if you are on Social Security and drawing unemployment benefits, that Illinois is, before this law passed, was one of 2 states that reduced the amount that you were getting from unemployment benefits because you were also getting Social Security. And it's got about a $25 million price tag, but so big labor got something out of this. This is an agreed bill process that we've used in the past, and the 2 interest groups essentially negotiate something out and the legislature ratifies it, but it is a win-win. And it's much more difficult to see those win-wins when you get to workers' comp and when you get to tort reform. Those are much more difficult, and collective bargaining. What are the things that you're going to give back to public employee unions if you take away their ability to strike over or negotiate over wages, and so this was the low-hanging fruit. There are some, the other issues. Even though it would be nice to have this process of the 2 interest groups resolving them mutually, it's going to be very difficult to do on the issues that are left.
Well, we have seen the governor back off of several of the bullet points on his agenda. Professor Redfield, can you see a scenario where he gets this, maybe gets property tax reform, and we move on for the time being? Or?
Yeah, yes, term limits and redistricting reform don't have to be done now, even if you know, to put them on the ballot in 2017. Redistricting reform may get on the ballot through the initiative process. Neither one of them term limits would, redistricting reform would affect things in 2022, term limits in 2024. Those are not immediate sorts of things. Workers' comp, the Senate President has already indicated some willingness to do some things there. I think the same thing's true with tort reform. Property taxes, what's hanging that up is what's hanging a lot of things up is the collective bargaining. And so that's really the tough nut. Once you either take collective bargaining off the table or you come to some agreement as to some things you're going to do, like prohibit public employee unions from bargaining over pensions, or doing something to modify prevailing wage on construction projects. But if you really want to essentially eviscerate collective bargaining for public employees, then we're not getting a budget anytime soon.
Well, and kind of doubling back to one of the other bills that we talked about here, the money that would be passed through to local governments, lottery winners, 911 dispatch centers, a whole laundry list of folks that comes out of special funds and not the general revenue fund. It was approved in the House, but a hold was put on the bill, so it won't go over to the Senate. Barbara Flynn Curry put that hold on. She's a well-known Madigan ally. Andy, we see these holds happen fairly regularly over the last few years. John Cullerton, the Senate President, seems to like to put things on hold after they've passed. Why are these used sometimes to kind of keep a bill in the lurch?
Yeah, so if somebody puts a hold on something like that, typically they're waiting to get something else out of it. Maybe waiting to see how things develop on some of the other areas. But the governor also, had said that this was one of the things that he wanted. This is one of the bricks, sort of, that he had moved off earlier this week, and he even added something to it, which was, let's also talk about, the money for salt during the snowy season. But in terms of putting the parliamentary sort of hold on it, typically they're waiting to sort of see how negotiations in other areas proceed after that.
So this legislation would kind of tamp down a lot of the news stories that we have heard lately about, as Andy just said, whether local municipalities will have salt to spread on the roads this winter. Professor, if this bill does, make it to the governor's desk, how does it affect the budgeting process, and won't it take a lot of pressure off of getting an overall budget done? Well,
it does take the pressure off. I mean, again, we're not talking about general revenue money that we could put in higher ed, or we could put in autism, or where there's discretionary. These are generally their motor fuel tax things, their lottery winnings, they're things taxes you pay on your cell phone going to 911. A lot of this is appropriating special funds that you can only use for those specific purposes. And so, we're essentially, we've been, we could have appropriated all of this stuff the 1st of July and not had any impact on the really hard budget questions, which are, how are we going to match up revenues with discretionary spending in terms of the general revenue fund. So these are not monies that we can use somewhere else, although there has been certainly speculation that the governor wants to hold as much money in those special funds as possible so that they can perhaps sweep them to get money to put together this Band-Aid that we're going to have to kind of fix, a 6 month, a 12-month spending plan with 6 months worth of revenue. And
similar to what was done last fiscal year.
Sure. And so this, everything becomes everything. Every piece of legislation, every move is the first cousin of everything else that you're doing. Everything is related in this go around, and so you're jockeying for position and leverage. Now, we're not appropriating money we couldn't spend anywhere. We're talking about whether, if we don't do this, then the governor will hold child care hostage for another 2 months. I mean, these are real people, real needs, real lives. I mean, that gets lost sometimes in kind of the politics of what's Representative Duncan doing, or is Madigan winning, or is Rauner winning. And this is a terrible situation that is wreaking all kinds of havoc on real people, on their lives. And the fact that we've taken this little bit of movement to be kind of the first robin of the spring. Everybody is so hopeful, and there may be 2 or 3 more bad winter storms out there before we get there.
Well, and Andy, you touched on the meeting between the leaders and the governor that's scheduled to take place next week. We had some update on that this week, or maybe lack of update.
Right.
The groups.
Yeah. It's a quick recap is that some of the, I guess you could say, good government groups like the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform and some others had asked for this public budget meeting between the legislative leaders and the governor. Speaker Madigan agreed to it, and sort of everybody else kind of fell in line, and the governor said, I'd be happy to have a meeting. We're going to do it in my office. I'm going to set the agenda. And there was some confusion about exactly what it would entail from there, but the difference between this and other meetings would be that supposedly it was going to be live streamed and it was going to be sort of this public spectacle. Well, we still don't really know exactly where it's going to take place. We have a date. It's November 18th, so next week. But now, just today, in fact, some business groups have come out and said this shouldn't take place in public. Good faith negotiations happen behind closed doors. This is how we got the movement on the unemployment insurance agreement. Let's do it that way. Groups like the retail merchants, the manufacturers, and some others. There is perhaps some merit to that. We've seen plenty of agreements to the extent that there are plenty of agreements left in state government. We see them happen sort of after these closed door sessions and sort of come out at the end of session and what have you. But you could also see it as those groups wanting to provide some political cover to the governor. Those are typically his allies. So it's an interesting scenario. The stuff that happened this week kind of adds some more nuance to it. But we still don't exactly know how that's going to play out.
Yeah, and heading into this meeting, Professor, as Andy just said, the stuff that happened this week definitely has people maybe a little more focused on what's going to happen next week. Where do we see things standing as far as the House's action? Did they reject an overture from the governor? I mean, what's the attitude coming into this meeting?
Well, again, if you've got some questions among Speaker Madigan about exactly what the game is in relation to particularly John Cullerton, the Senate President, perhaps the Mayor of Chicago, Mayor Rahm Emanuel, then that's not a good basis for going forward. We assume the Republican leadership of the House and the Senate and the governor are on the same page, but you certainly don't need that type of tension, and it might make it more difficult to get what would probably be the smart move on the Democrats' part, which would be to put together a couple of modest proposals, something on workers' comp, something on tort reform. I mean, it's not like what the governor did this week were major sorts of things that suddenly everybody says, oh, now I see how we're going to close a $4 billion budget hole. I mean, we've got this horrendous budget situation that we're going to have agreements on, and that's going to have to be done in private, and you're going to have to negotiate who's going to be on what roll call once you get to get there. But the Democrats, I think, could probably put out a few modest proposals, because what the governor did was very modest, and then just so that if that happens, then you've inched a little bit forward, and they can kind of agree to sit down and talk about some outlines of things in public, and then get to the real negotiations. So, it could also deteriorate into the normal, kind of, everybody reading their bullet points and going home sort of thing. But it will be interesting to see whether the Democrats assume that, their strategy is winning, they just need to keep going, or whether a little counter proposal to show some movement on their side would be useful at this point.
Yeah, if the governor can kind of frame things that he's moved towards compromise some this week, Andy, wouldn't it in some ways be in the Democrats' interest to respond in kind with even baby steps before this meeting?
Yeah, sure, because, all this week, I think maybe, folks were surprised after so many months of stalemate to see, okay, here's, one thing that, people may disagree on the specifics, but here's the governor coming out and saying, okay, I'm willing to work on this. This is one proposal that I'm relenting on. Even if he maybe doesn't explicitly say it like that, it's easy to interpret that happens, and you had several of those things, as we pointed out at the top of the show. I don't know obviously what the Democrat strategy will be. It's hard to say after some of the votes this week that were obviously very heated, and you would still signify that the political sort of pressure of everything is still there, and tempers are still high. But after a week or so of news coverage and press releases about what the governor is doing or what he's relenting on, it is arguably in their interest to kind of come back and say, okay, now here's what we think needs to happen now.
Well, and I'm sorry, we are going to have to leave it at that for this week, but I'm sure we'll have plenty to discuss in the coming weeks. I'd like to thank my guests, Professor Kent Redfield and Andy Maloney. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.